I have the particular pleasure to welcome to this evening plenary Aimee van Wynsberghe, who is Associate Professor in Ethics and Technology at the Technical University Delft in the Netherlands. Professor van Wynsberghe is the Scientific Director of the TPM AI Lab. She is co-director of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics and serves as a member of the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI. She is a 2018 L'Oréal UNESCO for Women in Science laureate and fellow at the Deloitte Center for the Edge. In 2019, she has been named one of the 25 women in robotics you need to know about. And most rightly so, since she connects research and outreach in truly exceptional ways, putting out highly informative white papers, for instance, one on sex robots, keeping up an insanely busy interview activity. I actually think van Wynsberghe is a collective, not an individual, and organizing in collaboration with Deloitte a new quality mark for responsible robotics. She is actively working towards influencing industry and legislation. On the other hand, on the basis of extensive empirical studies, she has developed a concrete method for the development of culturally sustainable applications called care-centered value-sensitive design, incorporating the principles of the ethics of care into value-sensitive design, which I suspect will also be the background of the talk we will hear today. So thank you very much, Aimee, for being with us today. We are very much looking forward to your lecture. Let me first make our usual practical remark before I give you the word. You may comment anytime in the chat, but once Professor van Wynsberghe's talk is over, we will draw a literal line, a physical line in the chat, and then we will accept the questions that come up in the chat, first come, first serve. And with this, Aimee, may I welcome you and ask you for your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johanna. What a warm greeting and thank you for the invitation to be here to speak this afternoon. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you're all coming from. Thank you for joining me. Let me first, before I start sharing my screen, I just wanted to congratulate Johanna and Marco for an incredible job that you're doing. I think it's really exciting how you've given so much thought to what is really appreciated about conferences when we meet in person and trying to translate that into the digital space. So big congratulations for me. This has been a wonderful, exciting event for myself. Great.
Thank you.
How is that? You can see?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. Great. So again, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Marco and Johanna, for inviting me. I hate to disappoint you, Johanna. You had mentioned that we might see care-centered, value-sensitive design in this presentation, but I'm going to do something a little. Still using care ethics as a resource to articulate and to explore the topic of social robotics. But I'm going to bring together two strands of thought. The first being, of course, the theme of the conference, which is cultural sustainability under the umbrella of social robotics, or exploring that in particular. And the second is that I want to continue the work that I've been doing in care ethics for the last decade and a half or so. But whereas Johanna was describing my original or my previous work was about looking at how we can use the values from the care ethics tradition to inform designers and also hospital administrators or implementers on how to either design or implement the technology. Instead, now what I would like to do is to focus on a particular construct or aspect within the care ethics tradition that I think has been underrepresented in the field of robot ethics, and in particular in the field of social robotics, and that is mutual care or reciprocity. Now, to sort of take a step back and explain, you know, my thinking or the broader picture of how I came to be thinking about this topic, I should say I share many of the sentiments that have been expressed so far throughout the conference. In particular, yesterday or last evening's keynote by Shannon Fowler really, you know, struck a chord about this idea of moral debt and the reckoning that we are now facing. And instead of using that language or that framing, I like to think about, or not like to think about, but I am thinking and envisioning this kind of vicious cycle that we seem to be in right now when it comes to the design and the development and the implementation of robotics technologies. And so to be a bit provocative here, I would suggest that we are currently creating bad robotics technologies. And I say bad, not to be uneloquent, but I say bad referring to technologies that are eroding societal values, right? That are exacerbating cultural stereotypes or are threatening societal values that we hold dear to us. And so, you know, when we think of this erosion, a beautiful way of envisioning this is, you know, how Shannon was speaking yesterday about inheriting this moral debt, or exacerbating this debt. But throughout the conference, we've heard of a variety of different kinds of values that are being eroded, or ways in which values are being eroded. We've heard about the representation of robots as being white or female or childlike, and this idea that they are obedient, subservient, again, you know, the language that Shannon was using yesterday. But however you cash it out, I believe that we are in the midst of creating bad robotics products, and the way we define this is through the fact that these products are eroding our societal values. Now, why I think this is so important, besides the fact that we're creating these products and threatening cultural values, but we've also heard that it's so much easier to make products that erode these societal values, right? It doesn't cost as much money, and it certainly doesn't cost as much time, because you don't have to worry about participatory design, about involving ethicists in the design process, or about involving the potential end users and a variety of other stakeholders in the design. So we seem to be directing our resources towards these easy technologies that are less time consuming, that are more affordable. But in doing so, in making that choice, we are neglecting the other technologies, organizations, institutions that are there to uphold societal values. But in making this choice, in prioritizing these easier technologies, we will continue to proliferate these technologies, and we will find ourselves in a situation where we actually become dependent on the technology. So if you think about smartphones in general today, or if you think about the different apps that are on your phone, I have to have WhatsApp on my phone so that I can communicate with the parents that are in my children's class group. So if I don't have that, I have no way of staying connected and communicating with these parents and getting updates. So there's a kind of dependence now to use some of these technologies. And if we think about social robots, right, as more and more resources become directed towards Paro and other type robots, will there come a day where we are actually dependent on these technologies in order to provide entertainment or companionship for elderly persons or other persons who are living in their home? And now the reason why this dependence is so important, because this fuels a kind of asymmetry in power between the developers or the producers and the user or the consumer. Right? So the developer and the producer is the one that holds all of the power. They know that we need to use their technology to stay connected, or there is no alternative, whether it's more expensive or otherwise, there is no alternative, we have to use it. And with this enhanced or inflated sense of power, this facilitates or fosters a lack of accountability on the part of the technology developer, on the part of the producer. And when you have this lack of accountability, on the right-hand side, I'm not sure if you can see it because we have all of the pictures, the images, but on the right-hand side, you'll see that it says no incentives to do better. So with this lack of accountability, it sort of pushes in the direction where companies and also academic organizations have no incentive to do better because there's no pressure coming from anywhere to really do better. And this closes the loop. This brings us back again to the idea that we continue to create these bad robotics products. Now, it's, you know, the list, we've been doing robot ethics, we've been doing the ethics of social robots for quite a few years. So we can have quite an extensive list of societal values that we want to talk about that could possibly be eroded. But I want to suggest, and my talk is really about suggesting the addition of a value that is very rarely on this list. And that value is reciprocity, or what I would also refer to as mutual care. So my talk will really be about why this value should be added to the list. Now, what I also want to say before I get into, you know, when we're talking about care, we of course think about the canonical examples, the healthcare institution, the home setting, the educational setting, and those are very relevant. And I will talk about healthcare in the remainder of my talk. But what I also want to suggest and to emphasize is that care happens well beyond the walls of the healthcare institution or the family or the educational setting, right? And reciprocity as well happens and needs to happen and needs to be thought about outside of these contexts. So if we think about environmental sustainability, and I think in general, we need to be talking about environmental sustainability more often in the robotic space. I remember John Sullins, probably 2 Robophilosophies ago, you know, saying this in one of his keynotes, that it's time that we focus on this. And so I'm carrying the baton with you, John, that we have to be talking about environmental sustainability of these products, because they do already, and they will continue to contribute to our production of electronic waste. And I think it's important to consider that we are producing anywhere from 53 to 54 million metric tons of electronic waste a year. And of that electronic waste, 17.4% is actually recycled. That's crazy if you let those numbers actually sort of sink in right now. And outside of that 17.4%, we have to acknowledge that most of that electronic waste is getting shipped to other countries. And of course, I recognize we have the Basel Convention, we have the Rotterdam Agreement, we have instruments in place to try and prevent that and to reduce that, but we still see that there are ways of working around that, and that the majority of our electronic waste is being sent to different countries across Asia. And this is important because the electronic waste isn't just an eyesore. I mean, the picture that you're seeing here is just a very unattractive picture, but the chemicals from that waste go into the soil, go into the water, and are affecting the communities, the individuals in those places. And so, I mean, what does this have to do with reciprocity? This is exactly what I'm talking about when I say mutual care. These communities, in a sense, are caring for us, right? They are providing a kind of care by taking this electronic waste, involuntarily, but still taking this electronic waste, and we are doing nothing to provide any kind of care back to these communities. So I say that just to reiterate and to also set the stage that this concept that I'm talking about, reciprocity or mutual care, is much broader than how I will talk about it in the coming slides, which is specifically in the healthcare context. So moving into the healthcare context, another reason why I've been so struck by this idea of mutual care lately is a more immediate or close at hand example, if you will, the current global pandemic that we are in. And I don't know about other people, but at least for myself, I was struck, not in a good way, but I was just struck by the articles that I was reading where there wasn't the right kind of protective equipment or gear for the healthcare practitioners, where these individuals were suffering from trauma, were separated from their families, and there was no resources or support to help them to get through it. And so, to put it succinctly, the people that we were depending on to care for us were not being cared for themselves. And it's up to our organizations, whether governments, but it's also up to us as individuals to find a way to facilitate and to provide that care. Now, at the same time that the people, the humans who were providing care were being underserved, we also saw that resources were being directed towards the development of social robots for this same kind of space. So social robots that would help aging and older individuals in this time of the global pandemic who are socially isolated from other individuals, right? So we see this growing gap in the ability or the interest in providing care to the people who are providing us care, while at the same time resources being redirected to a technology that can solve a kind of a sliver of the equation or the problem. So, you know, bringing all of these things together, it really kind of struck me to ask this question, you know, is there a relationship between social robots and this concept of reciprocity? Or, you know, what is the impact of social robots on the concept of reciprocity? And I'm certainly not suggesting that there is a causal or correlated relationship, but I do think that there is something that we need to start talking about, and that's what I hope to do with my talk today. So in the next hour / 50 minutes, because I'm 10 minutes into it already, this is what I would like to cover. I'm going to start by talking about designing for reciprocity in the social robotics space. So already there are researchers who are explicitly looking at this construct of reciprocity and trying to embed it into the human-robot interaction. So I'd like to explore the ways in which this is happening. Then what I want to do is to use care ethics as a resource to give meaning to reciprocity, right? And I think, of course, you know, I don't want to come across as being ignorant here. I understand that reciprocity is, you know, heavily debated and discussed in sociology and moral development and political philosophy. But I do think that care ethics has some added benefit to talk about, especially because we're talking about caring interactions, these social relational interactions, but also because it adds this, these two dimensions, this micro and this macro level, which I will get into in more detail later. After focusing slightly on care ethics, I would like to talk about, you know, what could go right? If we get this right, if we actually say, great, we've succeeded in embedding reciprocity into the human-robot interaction, you know, what does that look like? And what does that mean in terms of it working, right? And then, of course, it wouldn't be an ethics talk if I didn't ask what could go wrong. So I also want to spend some time thinking about what could possibly go wrong. And I want to do this on two different levels. The first being the micro level or the dyadic level. So looking at human-robot interactions and human-human interactions. But the second being the macro or the political level. And what could the impact be on reciprocity understood as this political ideal and value that we need to sustain. And last, I would like to be provocative at the end to get the conversation going. And I would like to suggest that we need to rethink reciprocity in social robotics, rethink what it means and what the aims of reciprocity should actually be. So getting into it. Now, social robots, I certainly am not going to sit here and give a list of definition of social robots, because I imagine everyone is well versed on how to define social robots. The one thing that I would like to point out that I think is really important is we've seen a kind of evolution in the definition of social robots. That original developers, so Cynthia Brazil, you know, and for many of you recognize Kismet on the left, but that, you know, social robots were intended to be these robots whose goal was to have a long-lasting friendship, companionship, interaction with a human user. So that was the final goal of the social robot, and that was the endeavor of social robotics. But we're starting to see a kind of change, right? We see socially assistive robots. So robots that provide some sort of physical service to a human by helping them maintain or complete their activities of daily living, but they have social capabilities. They can be perceived as social. So I think this is really important because it broadens the scope of the technology that we're now talking about. Whereas originally when we would do an ethical evaluation of social robotics, it was, you know, these robots that were confined to certain activities, confined to certain contexts. And now we need to sort of open up and look around and say, wow, the majority of robots in industrial settings, right, like Baxter, that is meant to be perceived as social. So robots in industrial settings, in service applications, in care context, robots that are perceived or meant to be perceived as social should fall under the same kind of scrutiny, or should be examined in the same way that we have been examining social robots. Now, the other thing that I want to point out, which I imagine is not news to anyone who's listening to this talk, is that human-human interaction is usually what forms the basis of human-robot interaction, right? So we go from the human-human to the human-robot. And roboticists have explored a variety of features that they find in these human-human interactions that ought to be embedded into the human-robot interaction so that they can ensure it's an intuitive and a successful interaction. And so in fact, some researchers have actually created the idea of benchmarks. So that's 6 benchmarks to be exact, but you have these benchmarks that are present in human-human interactions, and they can be used to assess the success of a human-robot interaction. If you can match human-human interactions, then you have created a successful human-robot interaction. And now, interestingly enough, reciprocity is growing in sort of importance or significance when it comes to one of the attributes that's found in these human-human interactions that should be included in the human-robot interaction. Now, reciprocity in the robotic space, or from what I see from the literature, is generally understood or described as the golden rule, or some sort of variation of the golden rule. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or if you do something for me, I will do something for you. That's usually how reciprocity is described in the literature when they're talking about inscribing it into the human-robot interaction. So as I said before, reciprocity is now explicitly listed as one of these benchmarks that if you can succeed at convincing the human that they have engaged in a reciprocal interaction, then you have a successful human-robot interaction. And now the researchers, you know, they're not alone. It's not just robotics researchers that have been thinking about this or doing this. Actually, in human-computer interaction, this is where the idea first sort of came about. And Fogg and Nass were among the first researchers to look at can we embed reciprocity in a human-computer interaction? And they showed back in 1997 that users provided more helping behavior to a computer that had helped them previously than to a different computer. And so also users worked longer and performed higher quality work and felt happier when they were in this paradigm of human-computer interaction that had some sort of element of reciprocity embedded within. So then moving forward in 2013, I imagine we're all familiar with the International Conference on Social Robotics. There was a specific workshop that was called Taking Care of Each Other, Synchronization and Reciprocity for Social Companion Robots. And so in this workshop, there was a variety of researchers who were presenting their work, and really the suggestion was kind of crystallizing here that reciprocity could serve as a cornerstone in the future development of meaningful human-robot interactions. So accordingly then, it's believed that in the future, robots could assume more social roles in the human domain if the human-robot interaction would be more reciprocal. Now, some studies that have been done to actually examine or put into practice this idea of what would it look like if we incorporate reciprocity in the human-robot interaction. On the left, you see a robotic dog. On the right, you see the Hobbit robot. So on the left, there were studies done with, and this is the Khan et al. Reference at the bottom, there were studies done involving children. And the idea was to see if the robot behaved in a certain way, could you encourage children to reciprocate to the robot? So to give back in kind to the robot. And on the right, a slightly different, not using children, but experiments involving older adults in the home setting. And in these experiments, the idea was, could you somehow show that the robot was reciprocating to the human? So in the first set of studies involving children, the goal was to investigate whether children would reciprocate to the robot, whereas in the second set of experiments involving the older adults, the goal was to display that the robot was reciprocating towards the human user so as to increase the acceptability of the robot. So each is using reciprocity as a design paradigm, but they're using the construct differently. So now, across a range of disciplines, right, we see that reciprocity is, considered a central feature of moral life. It's considered a necessary feature in the moral development, of children. It's necessary for developing skills like empathy, cooperation, collaboration, and so on and so forth. And so with the increase in both the availability of robots that are perceived to be social and the intention to design for reciprocity, I suggest comes the need for moral learning. And I borrow this term from Ibo van de Poel, who talks about technology being a social experiment, and that some of the kinds of learning that we need to do as we experiment with this technology is practical, some is logistical, but some is moral learning about the moral repercussions of moving forward with this technology. So the kind of moral learning that I suggest, or the kind of questions that I suggest we ask or begin to ask, is what could go right if roboticists actually meet this benchmark for reciprocity? And further, is fostering reciprocity in human-robot interaction actually desirable on a broader scale and in the longer term? Now, so as I mentioned before, although the concept of reciprocity has been studied in a variety of domains, whether it's sociology, moral development, political philosophy, I am suggesting to use care ethics as a resource to shed significance and meaning of reciprocity in the kinds of interactions that constitute human-robot interactions with social robots. Namely, these are interactions of care. So for those of you who aren't so familiar with care ethics, it is a moral tradition really that started to crystallize in the 1980s. Some of the more famous care ethicists include Nell Noddings, Carol Gilligan, Joan Tronto. And really the idea or the push to use care ethics came out of a growing need in the 80s to shift the focus of moral theory from the Kantian rule-based theories and/or the consequentialist perspective towards moral reasoning that places relationality at the core. And so this means concepts like autonomy, which were traditionally thought of in terms of, the atomistic individual. The individual is the island. If I have decisions to make, I will make the decisions on my own. And instead, care ethicists are trying to push forward the idea that no individual is entirely on their own. We are always in relation to someone else or in relation to something else. So I, Aimee, as an individual, if I have to make decisions about my education, my job, my healthcare choices, I have to make them knowing that I have a role and relationship to my children, to my husband. I'm a new dog owner. That also changes the kinds of choices that I have available to me. So really, the idea that care ethicists are trying to emphasize is that individuals are always in relation to one another. So the picture on the left was meant to illustrate or to showcase this idea that no one exists as an island on their own. Now, the picture on the right, I was trying to visualize a more complicated concept, and that is responsiveness. So for one care ethicist in particular, she talks about the fact that care is the meeting of action and intention, right? If you provide care, but you don't actually, you're not into it, you're not whatever, that is not good care. Good care needs to be the motivation, the want to do it matched with the actual action of providing the care. And that in addition, we should be thinking about care as a series of activities. So it's not just isolated tasks, you know, you have to clean up after your kids, you have to clean up after your dog. It's this whole process, these practices of care that come together to form a larger sort of web of care. And when you look at the breakdown of the steps within care, responsiveness is an important element. Responsiveness has to do with the care receiver. And so the element of responsiveness, right, means that we have to pay attention to, or caregivers, sorry, have to pay attention to, did they provide good care? Meaning ask the care receiver, did I provide good care? And allow the care receiver to actually give, to have a voice, to give an opinion. So the element of responsiveness is meant to recalibrate care from this unidirectional action, you know, to give care to someone. No, you give care with someone. So it's meant to recalibrate the unidirectional paternalistic form of care that had been prevalent at the time to a bidirectional practice in which caregivers are both attentive to the particular needs of care receivers, as well as being attentive to if, when, and how such needs are met. So this understanding was really meant to cast off the traditional conceptions of care receivers as being these passive acceptors of care. But interestingly, this bidirectional conception, right, this idea that it's two ways, aligns with another construct in care ethics, which is reciprocity, or this idea of mutual care. So both reciprocity and responsiveness, they do share similarities. They both aim at empowering the otherwise vulnerable stakeholder, and they both illustrate that care is not one-sided, but they have some differences between the two, right? They're not the same, they're not interchangeable concepts. Reciprocity is about giving back to others when they have done something for us. You know, when a person grants me a favor, I want to do something back. I might grant them a favor, or I might do something in kind to respond. But responsiveness is about reacting to the actions of another. So if I am the care receiver and someone has moved me into a new position, I'm in the bed, the way of responding is to say, well, this position makes me a little bit sore, can you move me into a different position, right? So that is responding, but the reciprocation is different from responding. Now, interestingly, reciprocity then in the care ethics domain can be understood or can be cashed out in a individual or a dyadic micro level, if you will, and also on a macro level. So on the dyadic or the micro level, it structures our commitment to immediate caregivers, but on the political or the macro level, it structures our commitments to caregivers at large. So reciprocity on this macro level, it's about mutual care for those in society who serve as caregivers. And Joan Tronto, she insists that everyone is in need of care to a greater and to a lesser extent at different moments in their lives. And we need to pay attention to this, right? We should do away with the myth that to be in need of care is to be incomplete. And instead, if we recognize the ubiquity and the universality of care, then we can come closer to appreciating those who provide care. And so in line with this thinking, Tronto extends the thinking of reciprocity beyond a care relationship and insists that it must be understood as a political ideal that focuses on giving back to caregivers in a broader sense, making sure that caregivers are not economically punished for their role as caregivers. So in essence then, reciprocity in this broader sense should be understood both as the quality of the just state and as a principle for generating the obligation to support cooperative caring schemes that provide care well and in a just manner. So what we need to be thinking about is creating social institutions that enable caregivers to do the job of caretaking without becoming disadvantaged in the competition for social benefits. So from the lens of care ethics, right? And of course, I'd love to spend another hour talking about reciprocity through care, but But from the lens of care ethics, we're starting to see that reciprocity has a sort of rich kind of meaning. It's not just about how do we reciprocate between one human and another human, but it's also how do we reciprocate to caregivers at large as a part of what it means to be a just society or a just state. So with this understanding of reciprocity as this concept rich in meaning, then we ask, or then I'm asking, so what does it mean to design for reciprocal interactions in human-robot interaction? So as I mentioned before, that some researchers were proposing the idea of having these benchmarks, that if you can create human-robot interactions that successfully mimic human-human interactions, then you've reached the benchmark. And one of these benchmarks, one of the 6 benchmarks is reciprocity. And so to be sure, or to be careful here, the authors do make a difference between psychological and ontological. So the benchmark is psychological insofar as people believe or they perceive the robot to be capable of reciprocity. So it doesn't necessarily ontologically have to be proven. So then what happens if the benchmark is achieved, right? If we can get people to believe that a robot is capable of reciprocity. And then this is where I think the mutual care project, this is the Hobbit project, becomes really, really fascinating. So of course, this isn't a statistically significant project or results that I'm talking about. They did experiments with 49 individuals in 3 different European countries, so still somewhat substantial when we're talking about the social robotic space. But what they did is they had a control group and they had an experimental group. The control group, there was no indication of reciprocity on the part of the robot, but the experimental group, there was. So in the experimental group, the robot and the human would have to work together to complete a task like labeling a pen. So the person would be asked to bring a pen to the robot. The robot would say, this is a pen, yes, no. Then in the experimental group where they wanted to show the robot as being reciprocal, the robot would thank the person for bringing them the object or for helping them. And to give back, could they tell the person a joke? Or could they play the person a song or something along those lines? Now, the researchers concluded from their studies that in fact they had achieved this perceived reciprocity because the participants believed that the robot was capable of reciprocal interactions. And they believed this, they could tell because of how they answered the surveys or the questionnaires afterwards, that they believed that both the robot and the human were in need. Okay, so both of them had needs that had to be fulfilled. The robot was convincing the person it had a need, bring me this pen so I can learn what it is, and then it thanked the person afterwards. So this idea, though, of perceived reciprocity, of deceiving people or getting them to believe that the robot actually is in need or needs help, right? I think for me, that is what it boils down to. And what does it mean? Is it a bad thing to deceive people into thinking that the robot is in need? So I certainly am not the first person to question this idea of deception, right? Deception and infantilization is one of the top 6 ethical concerns that Sharkey and Sharkey raised back in 2012. John Sullins has talked about, the fact that robots can only meet one's physical and emotional needs on a superficial surface level and not truly satisfy these needs. So a kind of deception in how people feel their needs are being met. And Matthias Schutz, he talks about deception in terms of, or he talks about the greatest threat of social robots being this idea of a unidirectional bond, that people believe it is bidirectional, but it is really unidirectional. So they're deceived into thinking that the interaction is actually bidirectional. But going further into the literature, the discussion on deception, there are also other scholars out there who suggest that, humans deceive other humans when they're interacting. So deception in human-robot interaction isn't so bad, right? If we're basing human-robot interaction on human-human interaction and we want to make it as realistic as possible, and if people are deceiving other people, then is it so bad for a human or for a robot, to deceive the human in that interaction? So I would caution I would caution against that kind of thinking. I think that sort of conclusion is really dangerous because it fails to acknowledge that deception is not something that should be acceptable in the technologies that we humans create. And this is where I was also really inspired by Shannon Valor's talk yesterday, you know, thinking about the moral debt of deception. As we create these technologies that are deceiving humans, what kind of debt have we begun? And what kind of interest will this debt accrue over years and years and years of usage? So I think in addition, it fosters a kind of naturalistic fallacy to suggest that the negative realities of human-human interaction ought to be translated into human-robot interaction. Furthermore, I think it fails to account for the plurality of ways in which deception can be understood. And more importantly, I think it disregards the seriousness of the risk of deception to the foundational elements of social relationships. So I would suggest, instead of saying, don't worry about it, humans deceive other humans, so it's okay, I would suggest instead, let's start to be very specific about the kind of deception that we're worried about. And I'm suggesting that we should be worried about robots being able to deceive human users, that they can reciprocate to humans, or that they are deserving of reciprocation. So now talking about this deserving of reciprocation, I think that people confuse the robot responding to a human command with the robot being able to reciprocate, right? So it creates a kind of faux act of reciprocity. And this faux act of reciprocity, because it's just responsiveness, sort of draws humans in to reciprocate to the robot. And now Matthias Schutz talked about this back in 2012 with the Roomba. And I know that Roomba is not a canonical social robot, but again, it makes us think about, you know, this shift or this evolution in the definition of social robotics. Or social robots, it's not a term reserved anymore for these robots that are meant to be our longtime companions. It's robots that are perceived to be social. And whether it's us projecting some kind of sociality on them or not, still, the Roomba is perceived to be quite social. Anyway, so Matthias Schutz, he talks about the vacuum cleaning robot Roomba, and he says that humans project their own beliefs about the robot's social maturity onto the robot to such an extent that after extensive experience with the robot, in which the robot was meeting the needs of their users by keeping the floor clean, the human users began to treat it as an entity deserving of reciprocity. So the mere fact that an autonomous machine keeps working for them day in and day out seems to evoke a sense of, if not urge for, reciprocation. And Roomba owners seem to want to do something nice for their Roombas, even though the robot does not even know that it has owners. So I think the fascinating thing here is that the robot is able to draw the human into a situation in which the human is deceived into thinking that he or she should reciprocate to the robot, rather than understanding that the robot is merely responding to its commands. It's fulfilling its task that it has been pre-assigned. Okay, so even still, right? Even if someone wants to say, all right, Aimee, let's allow for some, let's still say that there could be some good that comes from embedding reciprocity in human-robot interactions. Let's bracket the deception. Let's bracket this idea of, you know, calling on humans to actually reciprocate to the robots. Let's say, is there still something good that could come from us? And there are researchers that are saying that, right? And the ones that I'm thinking of in particular are those who are advocates of robots for pro-sociality. So this is an area of research where the idea is to propose autonomous systems or robots for promoting pro-social behavior. And the goal in this space is to create robots to nudge or to nurture cooperation and pro-sociality in a society of humans and machines. And so for this group, the starting point is the empathy deficit. That's at least, you know, what you see in the papers, that there's a general lack of empathy development in younger generations. And so the idea then is to create a machine that can help to establish or foster cooperation and even empathy through the robotic interface or the robot as a part of a team of actors. So keeping in mind that there is this relationship or this link between the development of empathy and the development of the capability or possibility for reciprocity. So if we were to take this thinking to its logical conclusion, so I imagine some of you out there are thinking technological solutionism. That's the first thing that might come to mind, but let's put that aside and let's take this to its logical conclusion, right? Humans would be able to interact with robots to learn the skills of empathy, cooperation, and reciprocity, right? To become, humans would become these sort of moral functioning members of society. Then where does this take us? Well, first, we should be clear about which humans we're talking about. And we need to be specific that the majority of studies that are done involving social robots and humans are with the humans being younger children or older adults. And the studies involving reciprocity are younger children and older adults. So with older adults, this is not the aim. Pro-sociality is not the aim. Reciprocity is not the aim. The robot is not an instrument to train older adults in their own homes how to, develop skills of reciprocity. Instead, it's used to encourage acceptance towards the robot. I use that in quotations, yeah? But alternatively, okay, so put that aside, let's say that, well, we could use this technology with children to help them develop the skills of reciprocity, right? The robot could be this instrument to help us become these flourishing individuals. Well, this then raises a lot of other questions. Will reciprocity from human-robot interaction translate to human-human interaction, right? What is reciprocity to the robot? It could be saying thank you, that's somewhat meaningless, but really the real kind of reciprocity towards a robot is changing the robot's batteries or recharging the batteries, updating software, that kind of thing. So those are skills or components of reciprocity that are not transferable to the humans. Also, the paradigm in which reciprocity is used, and again, I'm drawing on what Shannon Valor was talking about yesterday. She was talking about the paradigm of human-robot interaction is one in which the robot is this obedient and subservient agent, right? And if we are teaching people to learn the skill of reciprocity in a paradigm where your partner is an obedient and subservient agent, do we want that skill to transfer over into the human-human interaction realm? So another problem added to it. And then, the third point here is that this is entirely empirical. So I understand that these are empirical questions that I am asking, but I also want to suggest that because they're empirical, right, we need to create measurements to understand if reciprocity was causally or, if there was some correlation between the human-robot interaction and the human-human interaction. The measurements will have to take into account the variety of ways in which reciprocity is understood and achieved between cultures and between groups of people within the same culture. And so this is an incredible amount of resources, time and money that would be needed to prove the goal of creating robots to facilitate reciprocity amongst humans in society. And we're talking about a world with finite resources. So is this the kind of aim that we actually want to pursue? So consequently then, I suggest if researchers do get it right, this was them getting it right. This is what it looks like if they get it right. If they get it right and they're able to design for reciprocity in an effort to increase the chances of users accepting the social robot accepting the social robot, they have to do so by deceiving the users into believing that the social robot is capable of reciprocity or is deserving of reciprocity. And so one could make the justification that this deception is acceptable, given that reciprocity is a fundamental component of moral development, and as such, human-robot interaction could be instrumental in fostering reciprocity in human-human interaction. But this hypothesis rests on the belief that the skills developed during human-robot interactions would be transferable to human-human interactions. But now, all of these considerations aside, it's also necessary that we acknowledge that the reflections or the stream of thought that I just went down has to do with human-robot interactions on this dyadic level. A human and a robot interacting with each other, and a human and another human interacting with each other. And it pays little to no attention to the reality that robots are entering complex socio-technical systems. And further, that reciprocity also holds value and meaning on this societal level. So building on this further, I think, again, Shannon mentioned this yesterday when she was talking about how the robot ethics now needs to start to pay attention to the reality that robots are entering into these socio-technical systems and are a product of, and also the power dynamics that are inherent here. And in the same line of thinking, I echo the sentiment, and I say that human-robot interaction studies and robot ethics as well, they've really focused on this dyadic interaction between the human and the robot. And in so doing, the studies failed to account for the reality that robots are never just interacting with one human. They're interacting with a complex system of actors, both human and non-human. And so as such, the wider social context has to be taken into consideration when assessing or evaluating a social robot. Given that, robots will redistribute resources, tasks, roles, and responsibilities. So again, thinking of the cornerstone or the pillars of care ethics, now we need to shift and to focus on, or to pay attention to, what care ethics is telling us to pay attention to. And so the three pictures that you see before you, you have an industrial or a very service space on the left-hand side. In the middle, you have a drone. This could be used in humanitarian context. This could be used in a healthcare space. And on the right, you have a stethoscope to represent the healthcare space. But the idea here is that no matter what application of robot we are talking about, the robot will redistribute and will impact the roles, the responsibility. It will restructure the system into which it has entered. And myself and one of my PhDs, Shuhang Li, we published a paper last year trying to talk about this very idea, this very theme, where we say instead of human-robot interaction now, we need to talk about human-robot system interaction. And so what does this mean, though, if I say restructuring the entire system that it's in? Well, if you take healthcare as an example, we need to pay attention to the fact that once the robot is introduced into the healthcare system, it will restructure that system. So we could be talking about the restructuring of a hospital, of insurance agencies, of home care, of hospital care. So the system, really. And it does this in a variety of ways. First, the roles of the healthcare staff are going to change once a robot is introduced into the space. And we saw this with surgical robots, that the role of the nurse changed drastically. Traditionally, the nurse would be taking care of the patient in the bed in the hospital. But the whole point of surgical robots was to minimize your time in the hospital. You would have less recovery time, less pain, less scarring, so you'd be able to leave the hospital faster. But that meant that nurses had to kind of train a family member who would be taking care of the patient at home. So the role of the nurse drastically changed once the robot was entered, but that's never factored into an evaluation or an assessment of surgical robots. So robots are going to change the kinds of tasks that professionals will have to do. They may also remove certain professions, right? Certain professions may no longer exist. Again, if we're talking about cleaning robots in a hospital, will there be a need for janitorial staff? The education of healthcare staff has to change to include robotic training, and the resources will have to be reallocated. So surgical robots, if I continue on with this example, they cost upwards of $1 million or €1 million. So where is the money going to come from in order to pay for that robot, at least for the initial down payment of that robot? And now another thing to consider, especially with the introduction of artificial intelligence into some robotic systems, is that the robot will restructure the system in a kind of an unexpected way, that it may start to challenge the expertise of the individuals within the system. So it may call into question the expertise. What do you do if a robot has given you certain advice and your health practitioner has not given you the same advice? Whose advice do you actually take? So what happens then when we consider this in the social robot spectrum, right? If we go back to this Hobbit project, it's important to know that when older people are in their home, especially if they fall under the umbrella or the auspices of a healthcare institution, there are occupational therapists that will visit them in their home. So we should consider, you know, what the practice looks like is that oftentimes there is a care worker or a team of care workers who goes to the home, and now we would have the robot there to increase or enhance the frequency of care that can be provided. But if the robot is there as a semi-replacement, or is there at least to enhance the care, as they will be, right? If we're talking about older adults living in their homes, then we need to think about the resources like time and money that will be directed towards the social robot rather than towards the human caregivers. So money will be invested in the production, the implementation, the maintenance of the robot, rather than hiring and training new care workers. The education of the care workers, so thinking about the occupational therapists, the people who visit the homes and provide the care, they will have to have education to include how to interact with or how to manage your social robot, right? Or how to technically deal with these faults of the social robot. Again, expertise of the care workers could be called into question if the Hobbit robot gives some kind of advice that the healthcare practitioner hadn't given, right? And in essence, though, what I'm trying to say is that the ability, because the time and the money is directed towards the robot, the ability to reciprocate to the human workers will be minimized because we're talking about finite resources, and they will be directed towards the design, the development, and the integration of the social robot into care. Moreover, the willingness or the interest of reciprocating to human care workers will also suffer as a result of this, you know, techno-optimism that's enshrined in the social robot, alongside the reality that the robot's ability to draw the user in to this reciprocal interaction, deceiving people into thinking that it has needs and it needs some sort of help. So, okay, what does this mean then for reciprocity? And I take the point of Johanna Siept at the very beginning of the conference when she was opening. She was saying, you know, this year, instead of philosophy of social robotics, let's do philosophy for social robotics. So how do we give advice or give something back to the people who are actually making the technology? So what I was trying to do was to confront us with the possibility of what things would look like if we met the benchmark of achieving perceived reciprocity. So if we actually accomplish this, and through an analysis of, you know, the construct of reciprocity from the care ethics tradition, the richness of reciprocity at the micro level, looking at this bidirectional nature for immediate caregivers, and the macro level, you know, that reciprocity is this instrument for a just society. So taking this understanding of reciprocity into consideration, it becomes clear that human-robot interaction alone cannot achieve this bidirectional value of reciprocity. The robots have to deceive their users into believing that it's capable of reciprocating, or that it's capable or should be deserving of reciprocation. Moreover, on the macro level, designing social robots for reciprocity threatens the ability and the willingness to reciprocate to human workers across society. So because of this then, because of these concerns, I suggest that we rethink the goal of reciprocity in social robots. And I think that social robots should be about enhancing our ability to reciprocate to humans, not reciprocation to robots or reciprocation from robots. So designing for reciprocity in social robots is enhancing the ability to mutually care for those who provide us with care. And of course, what does this look like? Well, thankfully enough, we actually have robotic examples out there that realize this idea that I'm talking about. So we have exoskeletons for nurses who can help them with lifting patients. So we're meeting a need for the caregiver so that that caregiver can continue on to provide care. The bottom left-hand corner is a tug robot that's carrying chemotherapy drugs throughout the hospital. these drugs are dangerous to interact with, and nurses don't often have the time to put on the protective gear to do this. So we are trying to promote the well-being of nurses by providing a robot application that helps to relieve them of a burden. So providing a care to the caregivers who are providing us with care. The middle robot is an RP7, a teleconference or a telecommunication robot that's used to facilitate communication between a healthcare practitioner and a patient in the bed. So in the current pandemic, when you don't want doctors exposed to infected patients, this is a way of still allowing for an interactive conversation or discussion between caregiver and care receiver, but taking care of the caregiver so that they don't have to threaten their well-being. And the robot on the right, this is one of Akara's robots. It's a robot for disinfecting, so killing viruses in the surgical suite or in the hospital room. So again, a robot that doesn't necessarily need to be social in the way that we're thinking about it, and yet is social by providing this value of reciprocity, by giving back to the people who are providing us with care. Okay, so wrapping up now, yeah? Going back to this vicious cycle where I had started, I suggest that reciprocity should be one of these values that we should be concerned about, you know, the erosion of societal values in the bottom left-hand corner, and that we should explicitly be paying attention to this value with regards to the cycle. You know, what happens if we ignore reciprocity too long, right? What kind of society are we going to be creating? And I think that we've seen with some of the robotic examples that I just gave, and you know, this is in line with, again, what Shannon was talking about yesterday, the reconstructive and the remedial robotics, we have a chance of turning that vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle, whether it's creating incentives to make better products or whether it's enhancing the accountability of the academic organizations and the companies who are making these robots. But there are ideas out there, and we need to emphasize and put pressure on organizations to continue with the robots that uphold societal values so that we can encourage the transition from the vicious to the virtuous cycle. And of course, I was talking about healthcare examples so that I could sort of, you know, stay focused on one context of use and development, but there are other examples out there. There's the RISE project, the robots in the service of the environment. This is one of the robots that's helping to replenish the coral reefs around the world. There are robots for cleaning hazardous waste, and Shannon mentioned others as well. So I guess have a call to action then, that the Robophilosophy community need to start creating incentives for companies and for universities to do this, to start to care for the communities and to continue to care for the communities that have been providing us with care, whether it's the communities that are far away, that are distant, that are having to deal with our electronic waste, or whether it's the immediate communities that are providing care for us that we seem to be ignoring. So wrapping up, my last slide, I started by sort of remarking on this lack of mutual care that I was observing in society that was becoming tangible or tacit through the stories that I was reading about our lack of willingness or ability to care for the care workers that were taking care of the millions of sick people around the world. I followed this by looking at, you know, the growing interest in mutual care in the human-robot interaction and what this looks like. And the third point, if we reach this benchmark, if we are actually successful of embedding reciprocity in the human-robot interaction, I was trying to show that I'm not so optimistic. I don't think that it looks so good when we look at it on the dyadic level. And then also on the macro level, that it's necessary to think about what reciprocity means in the larger picture on a larger scale so that we get a better understanding of what it means on the dyadic level, on just the human robot interaction. And so I'm suggesting, put it on the table, that we rethink the aim of social robotics, that it should be to enhance reciprocity among humans and not to be creating sociality or mechanisms for sociality and reciprocity between humans and robots. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And this was a work in progress. This is the first time that I'm putting it out there, so I welcome any and all comments and criticisms and feedback.